HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Pursuit of Dominance, 2,000 Years of Superpower Grand Strategy by Christopher J. Fettweis. Read by Tristan Morris. Preface. What should the United States do with its power? What goals should it have, and how should it pursue them? What kind of America should lead the world in the 21st century? Ultimately, what do we want this country to be? These are the basic questions of grand strategy, and Americans are hardly the first people to ask them. Many of history's superpowers found answers, seeking to make themselves secure and prosperous, to spread their ideologies and ideals, and, maybe most important, to assure that their power remained super. All strong countries want to preserve their status and maintain the favorable systemic status quo. Attempts to maintain the status quo are rarely the stuff of exciting historical drama. There are many books that recount the remarkable rise of Rome, for example, and even more that examine its dramatic fall, but far fewer that look at the times in between. Even contemporaries seemed less interested in the preservation of greatness. We have quite meager sources for the most successful reigns at the empire's peak, those of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, together 117 to 161 AD, since their peaceful, stable era lacked the massive spectacles that set the pens of historians in motion. Much more attention is paid to the conquests and crises, the triumphs and blunders. Competence and honorable governance are comparatively boring. This book seeks to enliven history's comparatively boring bits. It is less interested in how history's greatest powers rose or fell than in how they ruled. It examines not revision, but maintenance. Even the safest of countries face challenges, both real and imagined, and their reactions determine how long they stay safe. With great power comes great responsibility, as the saying goes. And strong countries often seek to improve the world in one way or another. They have the luxury to prioritize things other than their most basic needs. As it turns out, maintaining a favorable status quo can be just as difficult as arriving at one in the first place. So, fortunately for the listener, grand strategy is never boring. Hadrian can teach us as much as Augustus. If it is foolish to attempt to please both experts and laymen, then this book is foolish from the start. Its target is the person who knows little but who is interested in much, one who can learn fast and think analytically. Each chapter reflects the opinion of generations of historians, but adds original analysis and thoughts. Perhaps only experts will know where I add to conventional wisdoms, and perhaps, too, only they would care, in my attempt to explain how history's strongest powers endeavored to stay that way. No two cases are the same, thank goodness, and each contains plenty for us moderns to consider. This work comes out of a class that I have taught for about a decade at Tulane University, one based on a course first constructed by Admiral Stansfield Turner at the U.S. Naval War College in the early 1970s. Turner, who was president of the college, wanted to improve the strategic expertise of those in uniform. Under his guidance, the professors at the War College examined grand strategies from the past, speculating about their lessons and relevance to the challenges of their time. The long Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, for example, seemed like it might have something to teach the United States during the Cold War. The course is still taught in much the same way today. At Tulane, I changed the cases to reflect the conditions the United States faced in the early 21st century. The United States stood alone atop the international system, the strongest country in almost every measurable, and quite a few unmeasurable, category. The wisdom of the Athenians was made less urgent without a modern version of Sparta. Rome seemed more relevant. History's solo superpowers were more pertinent than those with a rival of roughly equivalent strength. I became interested in how the Tang dynasty stayed in power, and how the Ottomans ruled a polyglot empire in the world's toughest neighborhood for so long, and how the British maintained their dominance at sea. These comparisons might strike some listeners as odd, since the United States is not, nor does it seek to be, an empire. Others might claim that its strength is not as great as these others, or that it is shrinking, making U.S. superpower a thing of the past. With such notions, I disagree, and explain why in the coming chapters. Perhaps most observers might agree, however, that the United States remains quite powerful, more indeed than any potential rival, relative decline notwithstanding. Thus, there may well be something to learn from history's previous dominant states, even for those unconvinced that the United States is one of them. In the chapters to come, I make no effort to relate history even-handedly or completely. This has been done for every case here many times, and much better than I could ever do. This is a work of strategic analysis, rather than historical description, one in which I will emphasize the elements of the cases that relate to their grand strategies, and take diversions and digressions as my interests dictate. The chapters are narratives that contain discussions of national ends, ways, and means. The why and how of grand strategy drive the stories, rather than the other way around. Throughout, I try to synthesize history and security studies, and to merge what scholars refer to as the security studies and strategic studies approaches to grand strategy, in ways that may strike experts as distasteful. But what do experts know anyway? In these efforts, I have received help from a great team of research assistants. My sincere thanks go to Jenna Fisher, Lumen Lee, Helen Sussman, and Tatum West, whose assistance was only possible because of the generous support of Andrew Byers and his team at the Charles Koch Foundation, who also offered helpful feedback on my early draft chapters. Along the way, I consulted a number of historians, most of whom had the good sense to delete my communications immediately and block further emails. Some, however, responded and corrected some of my more preposterous errors. I am particularly grateful for the kind advice and counsel of Yeet Asikan, Yuan Kang Wang, George Bernstein, Pierre-Luc Brisson, Andrew Jureko, Tamer Asikalan, and John Mueller. So please just remember that no matter how unpleasant and shallow you find this book to be, it could have been significantly worse. What you are holding has also been my way of dealing with the election of Donald Trump. For 4 years, I found it much easier to think about Rome and the Mongols than modern-day United States. This work is a product of deep disappointment with my country, combined with optimism for the future. One positive lesson is clear up front, however. Superpowers usually survive even the most incompetent and/or venal leaders. Structural factors outweigh domestic politics, at least as far as international status is concerned, which is why the post-Trump United States will be in roughly the same position that it was in before he took office. What it will look like on the inside, whether its democracy survives, or how long it would take its society to recover, if it ever does, is another story. Republics fall, but status usually endures. New Orleans, Louisiana, February 2022. 1. Introduction. Carthage must be destroyed. Roman Senator Cato the Elder apparently finished every speech, no matter its subject, with this appeal. He also uttered it when casting votes in the Senate, and presumably his friends and family heard it on more than a few occasions as well. Cato did not want Rome distracted while Carthage still existed. It did not matter to him that his enemy was a shadow of its former self, having lost 2 major recent wars and all its colonies, or that it had been paying an annual tribute to Rome for decades. Carthage's coffers were bare, and its power controlled. But I shall not cease to fear her, Cato felt, until I know that she has been utterly destroyed. The senator got his wish in 149 BC. Rome declared war on the hapless remnants of Carthage for no real reason, what we might charitably call today a preventive action, and attacked. The Third Punic War went much faster than the first 2, and although the Carthaginians managed to hold out against the odds for 2 years, they eventually succumbed. Victorious Romans killed or enslaved the entire population and systematically burned down the city, leveling walls and salting fields to assure that their traditional rival would never regenerate. A Roman colony was then established on the ground of the massacre. one that presumably had to import most of its food for a while. Then Rome's real problems began. Among the witnesses to what came next was Sallust, Rome's first great historian. Before the destruction of Carthage, the people and Senate of Rome together governed the Republic peacefully and with moderation, he wrote. There was no strife among the citizens either for glory or for power. Fear of the enemy preserved the good morals of the state. As long as Carthage existed, Romans were united. When the minds of the people were relieved of that dread, wantonness and arrogance naturally arose. The peace for which they had longed in time of adversity, after they had gained it, according to Sallust, proved to be more cruel and bitter than adversity itself. Without their enemy, the Romans lost their moral compass, eventually descending into a condition where every man for himself robbed, pillaged, and plundered. And Cato had to find a new way to conclude his speeches. The inequality, injustice, and other social problems that had always existed in Rome were much harder to ignore without the Carthaginian boogeyman looming over the horizon. Partisan divides steadily widened, eventually leading to the first lethal political violence in more than 300 years. Over time, things grew steadily worse. The century before Christ contained a string of civil wars, each bloodier than the last. The republican institutions proved fragile. The center could not hold. Dictators rose out of the chaos. In the absence of serious danger, Romans turned on each other and destroyed their republic. More than 2 millennia later, another state faced much the same situation, finding itself alone atop the international hierarchy after decades of superpower rivalry. Americans longed to defeat the Soviets as lustily as the Romans wanted to vanquish Carthage. They had their own Catos, who focused all their attention on the Cold War competition between good and evil, and who were willing to compromise almost any American value for the sake of victory. Not long after that goal was achieved, however, the Roman pattern emerged. Domestic partisanship grew to heights not seen since the 1860s. Internationally, the United States ambled along in the post-Soviet world rudderless, committing blunders large and small as its strategy vacillated drastically from one president to the next. Fed a steady diet of fear by their leaders and media, Americans now perceive threats and dangers everywhere. The Chinese are rising and becoming more aggressive, while the Russians are reasserting their power. Various rogues from Iran to Venezuela are perpetually forming and reforming new axes of evil. Terrorism has not gone away, and neither have populism, violence, nor drugs. All this adds up to an especially complex world, one in which U.S. power and influence has dangerously waned, or so we are told. American pessimists should take heart. Although Rome's republic fell, its power persisted, and it remained the undisputed master in the Mediterranean for another 500 years after the destruction of Carthage. Indeed, all of history's greatest powers experienced periodic ups and downs, but generally managed to survive. Whether countries retain their status over time depends on the choices made by their leaders, or what students of international politics call their grand strategy. How did previous empires, regional hegemons, or simply dominant powers define their interests and then assemble the tools to address them? What can current U.S. strategists learn from the experience of earlier powerful states? Countries atop international hierarchies are not necessarily any better at answering these questions than those below them. In fact, without great dangers to concentrate the mind, they often struggle more and make bigger mistakes. This is a book about how strong countries endeavor to stay that way. It will explain how some of history's greatest powers, from Rome to the British Empire, identified and pursued their interests. Along the way, each did some things right, clearly, but they also botched other things up on occasion. They eventually fell victim to forces beyond their control, or made blunders that assured their downfall. Each is unique, but in some ways, to paraphrase Twain, their experiences rhyme. On grand strategy. What are we trying to accomplish, and why do we want to do it? How are we going to get it done? Who will try to stop us, get in our way? pose a problem, or just generally bother us, and how do we deal with them? These are important questions that leaders must answer, and by doing so, they create grand strategy. All countries have one, whether they realize it or not. Grand strategy is today both a buzzword and a major subject of academic inquiry, one of those rare topics that bridge the gap between scholarly and policy communities. It is thrown around by the amateur strategists of social media. It is studied in universities across the country, from Yale to Texas A&M and the various war colleges. It is discussed in think tanks and academic conferences, in graduate seminars and staterooms. One might think that with all the attention paid to it over the last 3 decades, broad agreement would exist about what exactly grand strategy is, or even that such a thing actually exists, because skeptics abound. A comprehensive bibliography would include hundreds of works, but few common definitions. In its simplest form, grand strategy is the art of marshaling resources to pursue national goals. It first helps leaders identify and prioritize their ends, or why to act. It then prescribes how to attain those goals, or the ways and means to employ. The combination of these two elements, the why and the how, makes grand strategy grand, separating it from lower levels of thought and action. Misjudgment of either aspect can lead to disaster, examples of which are not hard to find. It turns out that grand strategy is difficult for mortals and divine beings alike. As representatives of the former category, leaders during the First World War were particularly terrible at determining the why aspects of grand strategy. Perhaps it would cheer them up to find out that even God himself struggled with strategy early in his career. The Almighty proved surprisingly bad at determining how to accomplish his goals at the lowest possible cost. A little explanation might make the point clear, if somewhat blasphemous in both cases. Why did the First World War happen? What were the combatants trying to accomplish? Certainly, the men in the trenches had no idea, and they would have been disheartened to realize just how little thought their leaders gave to the matter. Millions of words have been written to explain the cause of the war, or why the great powers sent so many to their deaths, since there was never a real reason. An Austrian crown prince was assassinated by Serbian malcontents, and before long Germany attacked France. At the very least, once the initial offensives of summer 1914 failed, the belligerents should have recognized that not only were their assumptions about modern warfare all wrong, but that no imaginable benefit could possibly justify the enormous costs victory would certainly entail. The war was not fought to make a better peace. Indeed, nobody could even articulate what that would be. Goals were occasionally identified as the years went on. The French wanted Alsace-Lorraine. The British worried about Belgium. Everybody wanted some bits of Eastern Europe. But these were trivial, ad hoc rationalizations to continue fighting, not actual ends that anyone had articulated a priori. In the lead-up to the war, and especially once the shooting started, grand strategy was silent. World War I was run by generals, a group who, as a rule, values political cause less than victory itself. Military establishments on both sides in 1914 urged bloody persistence, long after national interest had become irrelevant to the proceedings. Political leaders, whose task it is to focus war aims and keep costs in line with benefits, failed miserably. All wars are idiotic and immoral to some degree, but this one was exceptional in both categories. Its participants could not answer the most basic of strategic questions, or explain why they were so determined to win, or what their ultimate ends were. 11 million people died for the sake of victory alone. Some thousands of years earlier, God had a clear goal, or so the book of Exodus tells us. He wanted to rescue his people from Egyptian captivity and slavery. His end was defined. The next task was to figure out how to achieve that goal and to deal with a problem, since Pharaoh seemed pretty intent on keeping God's people in chains as long as there was work to be done. The Lord had to figure out how to achieve his goals while facing a rival with opposing interests. He needed ways and means. Good strategists pursue their ends with the least amount of effort, or at lowest cost. God had some pretty powerful tools at his disposal, including but not limited to omniscience and omnipotence. One would think that unusually vivid dreams in the right heads, or a few burning bushes, or a well-placed lightning bolt or two would have convinced Pharaoh to let his people go. Instead, he chose to act with his signature plausible deniability, unleashing a series of plagues. He turned drinking water into blood for some reason, and unleashed frogs, locusts, flies, lice, and hail. Livestock perished. Boils appeared on Egyptian skin, and darkness covered the entire country for 3 days. Firstborn sons died. Eventually, Pharaoh got the point, but it took months, and in the process countless lives were lost, including those of many innocent boys, and not a few frogs. All this happened when many other options existed, ones that would have achieved the objective more quickly and cheaply. God could have used an advisor brave enough to point out that his ways and means were unnecessarily costly and inefficient. With a better grand strategy, the Almighty could have achieved his objectives much more quickly and cheaply. Then again, I suppose, who are we to judge? Why and how are the essential elements of grand strategy. Too often one is ignored for the sake of the other, by leaders or by the scholars who study and judge them. Fortunately for those beleaguered and exhausted policymakers, there is a definite logic to grand strategy, one that applies to all eras and gives structure to this book. The logic of grand strategy. The rules of international politics evolve over time. Actions that seemed totally reasonable in the ancient world would strike us as barbarism today, and vice versa, no doubt. Genocide and ethnic cleansing were tools available to the Romans and Mongols, but not modern presidents, just as states once thought nothing of pursuing prosperity with privateering and slavery. Not only means, but national goals and priorities vary greatly from age to age. It will never be possible, therefore, to construct a single, unifying, timeless grand strategy that could succeed in every era. Instead, understanding one's time is the most basic of tasks for the strategists. One must have a grounding in theory, in other words, even if that word is rarely used in the practical world of the policymaker. Strong states often drive evolution in thought and action. Superpowers are both products of their time and parents of it. Beliefs held in imperial capitals do not stay there, but trickle down to shape the behavior of everyone else. To some extent, in other words, dominant states are theory's entrepreneurs. Theory also helps states interpret their surroundings. Expectations about what in Pentagon argot is known as the security environment, or what normals call the rest of the world, are shaped by the rules and norms of their time. Grand strategy is not forged in a vacuum. The outside world gets a vote in its formulation. Polish grand strategy in the 1930s was going to be far different from that of the United States, and not just because of power differentials. The range of options is wider for those surrounded by Canada, Mexico, and fish, rather than Stalin and Hitler. Indeed, the presence of other actors is what separates strategy from planning. One does not need a strategy to get to the other side of town, or to buy groceries, or to get a project done before vacation, since there is no one trying to prevent success. A plan is sufficient. If, however, interaction with other actors is inevitable, a strategy is necessary. One can begin an inherently strategic activity like chess with a game plan, but the opponent has a say in what happens, and adjustments are going to be required along the way. No plan survives contact with the enemy, according to the Prussian strategist Helmut von Moltke, or, according to a more recent strategist, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. It is the reaction to that contact, or to Mike Tyson's punch, that separates good strategists from bad. Assessing the threats and opportunities in the security environment is hardly an uncontroversial, empirical, straightforward exercise. Different people looking at the same evidence can construct wildly disparate interpretations of their surroundings. Some see threats everywhere and danger gathering around most corners. Others feel nearly invincible and consider neighbors essentially prey awaiting a clever hunter. George W. Bush thought the world was much more dangerous than did his successor, for example, and as a result, he constructed a more active, interventionist grand strategy. The security environment pulls and pushes foreign policy, depending on the extent of its dangers. And of course, wolves gather at home, too, whether in the form of rival parties, temperamental masses, or avaricious barons. One of the surest ways to encourage internal challenge is to construct an inefficient, overly aggressive, or simply unpopular grand strategy. Great power plays tricks with the ability to assess risk. Strange as it may seem, power and threat perception are directly related. The stronger a country is, the more danger it detects. Dominant states are by nature supporters of the status quo and are quick to involve themselves in potential turbulence. For the power atop the mountain, movement can only occur in one direction. Instability and conflict anywhere might be the first steps towards systemic chaos and unpredictable status shakeups. Superpower insecurity has no natural limits and must constantly be kept in check, lest it lead to counterproductive ventures and unnecessary expansion. Overestimating threats can be as ruinous to the national interest as underestimating them. Interests, ends, and policies, ways. Some national interests are the same for all states. Security, for instance, is the most basic goal of statecraft, the prime directive of governments. If leaders cannot protect the lives and property of their people, then there is little point in having leaders. Once their basic safety is assured, people can then think about other things, like their general standard of living. While modern assessments put prosperity right behind security in the list of enduring national interests, for many states of the past, wealth was little more than a means to the end of security. Prosperity mattered only to the extent to which it could be transformed into military power, since ships and soldiers do not purchase themselves. Plenty of rulers have sought to enrich themselves or their cronies while making it clear that the condition of the masses mattered only when popular dissatisfaction spilled out into the streets. Valuing national wealth for its own sake is a rather novel notion, historically speaking. States care about more than power and wealth. They sometimes champion their ideology, or their religion, or their sense of fair play. States might value the preservation of peace, or the extension of justice, or the spread of freedom. They can even act on behalf of others, even if cynics rarely give them credit for doing so. Equally, if not more important than such altruistic goals, have been intangible interests, like the national honor, or the opinion of the gods. The priority they assign to such milieu goals, as political scientist Arnold Wolfers once called them, varies by state, leader, and era. In general, dominant states have more flexibility to identify and then pursue interests further down on the hierarchy of national needs, since their primary ones are essentially satisfied. Once national interests are defined, states must construct ways to pursue them. They create policies, or general guidelines for action. As we will see, generations of British strategists followed clear policies. They supported balanced power in continental Europe. They opposed unfriendly domination of the Low Countries, from which a seaborne invasion of the British Isles could have been launched, and they sought to keep their various trade routes open. To employ the common terminology, interests are ends, while policies are ways in which ends are pursued. Although the identification and prioritization of national interests is the starting point of grand strategy, the construction of policies is where creativity, wisdom, character, experience, and intelligence come into play, and where the process of grand strategy making often goes awry. After states construct their basic policies, the last step is to figure out how to execute them. Tools. Means. At a town hall meeting in Kuwait, in December 2004, a gutsy young U.S. Army specialist asked Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld why soldiers had to go to the local dump and find metal to up-armor their own vehicles. The secretary responded with recent history's most infamous admission of poor force planning. "As you know," he said, "you go to war with the army you have, Not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time. The United States had spent trillions on some of the most sophisticated weapons humanity had yet seen, but its planners failed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?